Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Students, now we are going on to chapter 11 of international business. This chapter basically will talk about ethics and social responsibility of international businesses. Ethics, as you might have encountered in many of your other subjects, is an important consideration for any manager or in the management of any business. However, we are going to look at this particular concept in the context of international business. So we are going to discuss what is ethics, how is it different from the social responsibility that every company normally needs to adhere to, and also we'll talk about why following ethics in an international scenario could become a little bit more challenging than simply following ethics in any type of business. Right, so I'll just give the objective. So basically, we have to understand that as companies, the managers need to satisfy stakeholders like shareholders, employees, customers, society, and we know that sometimes these stakeholders have conflicting interest. And as a manager, you need to satisfy this conflicting interest in the best way possible. And of course, by following the ethical standards that has been laid out by the company or simply the human consideration in terms of ethics. So what would that mean? To know that, let's go on to discuss the broad foundation of ethical behavior. So basically, ethical behavior has three levels in terms of moral development. What are they? So let's discuss that. First one is called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional or autonomous or principled. Now, when we say pre-conventional, basically what we mean is that uh, the behavior or the ethical behavior of the person is something which has been programmed into the minds of the person. Like for example, if there are certain things which I believe to be ethical, has been brought into my mind because of the way in which I have been brought up, maybe from the background that I am in, the country that I have lived in, or maybe the people whom I have met. While conventional is saying that when people understand universally what ethics is all about, and it means it's like a common knowledge that this behavior is considered to be ethical and this one is not. While at a higher level, you would be having a post-conventional or autonomous or principled ethical behavior. In this case, you don't have to think about whether I'm doing something ethical or unethical. Basically, ethics as a behavior has been ingrained into my mind, such that without even thinking, I can automatically behave in an ethical way. Okay, so basically we say that at the third level of moral development, ethical behavior comes naturally to you, right? There are different approaches to understanding ethical behavior. So the first one is a theological approach, which means that a person or maybe even an organization would first think about whether this particular behavior is ethical or not by considering the consequences of the action. Like for example, if let's say a particular behavior uh, would be ethical if the result of that behavior is good, or a particular behavior would be considered unethical if the consequence or the result of such behavior is bad. So this is something which is one particular foundation or one way of thinking. The second, we can say, approach to understanding ethical behavior is utilitarianism, where if the company or maybe the manager believes that an action is good if it produces more good as compared to the bad that it would produce. Okay, so it means it is like a what I can say is a comparative level of ethical behavior. If it is bringing in more good, then you consider it is ethical. If it is not bringing more good, or if it is bringing more bad, then it is considered to be unethical behavior. While the last approach, that is deontological approach, here the moral judgment is made regardless of what results it will bring, because here an understanding of a particular behavior as good or bad is already predetermined, and whether the results would be good or not regardless of that, a behavior will be considered to be ethical, and a particular behavior will be considered to be unethical. Right. So what about companies? Why should they care? So ethical behavior, in fact, is something which can make or break your company. Not only that, even it can make or break the we can say the feeling of people in the whole world. So here, normally, as a company, we would say that is more interested to generate profits rather than maybe talking about anything else. But however, even if you're thinking about ethical behavior in that context, companies do care about ethical behavior because of two important reasons. One is that it helps the company to have a competitive advantage. That is, it can show itself to be better than any other competition, we can say competitors, in the sense that an ethical company will have more value in the market. And the second reason is being that if a company is found to be unethical, it can also be perceived to be irresponsible, which may not gain the required respect to sustain itself in the real world. Fine. Next, we'll talk about the cultural and the ethical foundation of it. We can say legal foundation of ethical behavior. So here the question comes: if there is a particular ethical behavior, how can we make sure that the companies actually follow them? Now, here again, there are two things which we have already discussed in our previous chapter. One thing is the cultural aspect. It means maybe ethics itself can differ from one culture to another culture. I hope you're getting the point. Okay, so maybe something which is considered to be ethical in one culture may not seem ethical in another culture. In addition to that, what about the legal foundation? Remember in the chapter where we were discussing legal aspects of business, we understood that the law is different in different parts of the world. So when we are considering culture, when we are considering law, it should be understood that ethical behavior may be perceived differently in different parts of the world. So here we would say that ethical truth depends on maybe the company which is holding it, or the place where it has been taken into consideration or not. So here we have two concepts. One is called the relativism, which means the ethical truth, or we can say the ethical fact, depends on the group which is holding them. For example, maybe something which is considered to be ethical to the Saudis may not be the same, may not be the case maybe for maybe if I can say Chinese, or maybe a Japanese company, or maybe a Japanese company, or maybe a person, right? While on the other side, normativism is that there may not be any difference between the ethical behavior. There are some universal standards which any culture or any part of the world should be following. So you can also understand that ethics itself could be relative, or it could be normative. Normative ethical behavior are those behavior which is considered universally ethical in the whole world, and relative ethical behaviors are those behaviors which are considered to be different in different parts of the world. Right. So next we talk about. So do you think that there should be law to ensure that companies and, let's say, people follow ethical behavior? So here we will actually discuss two we can say phases of the debate. Here on one side we say that yes, laws could be good. What it means is that in order to ensure that companies are following ethics, we should bring in laws. And this opinion is true on one side. On the other side, we'll also talk about the cons. Cons means the opposite behavior, where people are arguing to say that no, bringing law to ensure ethics is not going to work. Okay, so first we'll talk about the second argument, where it is said that law may not be adequate, that is, law is inadequate to justify ethical behavior. These are the reason. The first reason is that some things that are not ethical and they are not illegal either. For example, maybe eve teasing. Eve teasing may not be illegal, but we know that it is unethical. So in that case, if you're bringing eve teasing into law, it may not work. So this is something we need to understand. Second one is laws are slow to develop in emerging areas of concern. Let's say there are some concern about ethics, And if you're trying to bring law for a particular behavior, it will take a lot of time, because law do not happen over time. It needs to be considered, it needs to be discussed, approved, and then brought in as a law. So maybe by that time, that topic of ethic may lose its importance, right? Okay, so the next reason why law may not be sufficient is laws may be based on imprecisely defined moral concepts. Now, we have already talked about law in our previous chapter. We need to understand that either it is rule of man or rule of books. The law itself need to be precisely worded. I mean, they have to define it in a proper way. But when we talk about ethics, some things may not be definable. I hope you're getting the point. So in that case, some undefinable things bringing into law may not work. This is what this particular topic means. This next idea is the law can often need to go scrutiny by the court of law, which may not work in maybe a day-to-day life. Maybe in a day-to-day life, or maybe sometimes ethics can just be a matter of maybe speaking out, or telling that you do not agree to a particular idea, or maybe you have seen something happening in the company and then maybe you are trying to oppose it. In that case, it may not to prove that it is illegal, you have to actually take it through the court of law. For ethics, some things may be so sensitive that it may not be fit to take it to the court of law. And finally, another reason that is which stands to say that laws may not be sufficient to ensure ethical enforcement is that law may not be efficient. Okay, so these are the 5 points which suggest that laws may not be adequate to ensure ethical behavior among people and among companies. Right, on the other side, we have on the pro side, we could say that yes, it is better to bring in law to ensure that people are following ethics. Now, the reason that they give for this particular argument is that law embodies many countries' moral principles. So most of the time, we see that the law of a particular country basically is actually enshrined in the ethical in the ethical or the moral principles based on that country. For example, if you will see Saudi Arabia, most of the things in the Sharia are basically the moral principles which people of this country are expected to follow, and the law of this country has actually embodied this Sharia law, right? So this is one reason where people who say law can be sufficient to ensure ethical behavior. The second reason is law provides a clearly defined set of rules, so it is very easy to follow the law rather than to try to understand what is ethical or unethical behavior. So if you can bring all the ethical behavior as a law, it would be easy to follow. The next point would be the law contains enforceable rules that apply to everybody. So when we talk about ethics, it may not be so very clearly defined, but if it was a law, people would understand it better because it could be enforced to everybody, or maybe even universally when it is required. Okay, law reflects careful and wide-ranging discussion. So like the topic that we discussed in the previous slide, we have to understand that law is actually not arbitrarily brought in. It has gone through the process of discussion, verification, and then finally brought in into action. So, bringing ethics under the purview of law would be more justifiable. Okay, so these two slides, slide number 11 and slide number 12, please have a look at this. This is a part of a bigger question where we could discuss the pros and cons of making ethical behavior, we can say what, justifiable legally. Fine. So let's go on. Next, we talk about extraterritoriality. This is a topic. I mean, this is just a concept which says that if you are having some ethical practices in your own company, are you going to enforce such a practice on maybe the country that you're going to operate in? Imagine you are a multinational company and you're operating in so many different countries. Are you going to enforce the same ethical behavior in all the countries in which you operate? Maybe your foreign subsidiaries or maybe your headquarters. So this is called extraterritoriality, which means that an ethical behavior or maybe an ethical concern of a particular multinational company, is it enforceable in all its operations? So this is a big question. So we say that we'll take one example of ethical behavior where which is very rampant in all over the world, which is called bribery, ethics and corporate bribery. So sometimes whether you use law or you don't use law, uh, you know. May not be the reason for not using the law as a starting. I mean, it could be a good starting point to start saying that bribery is intolerable. I mean, if the government says that bribery is illegal, and we know that bribery is an ethical concern also. Bribery, the word bribe means that you give maybe some money or maybe a monetary benefit to the legal authorities or people who are in position to take some action which is in your favor. Okay, so this one is a matter of big concern throughout, excuse me, throughout the whole world. Right, so countries looking for solution to common problems can take similar legal steps. That means activities that affect the well-being of people or maybe activities that affect the environment. So if the countries become very strict and make sure that there is no bribery, especially from the corporate house, in which is going to affect the well-being of the people or maybe which is going to affect the environment. We'll talk about this in a little while in the next slides to come. Right, so we'll talk about corruption and bribery. Now, corruption is people who are in high position. If they misuse their power for their own personal gain, then we call it as corruption. So, whenever there is rampant bribery, it means, I mean, it's equal to corruption. So, what is bribe? Here, bribe is the promise to pay or the payment of anything of value, maybe given to a person in an authority, maybe for obtaining some contracts, or even to get the public officials to do what they're anyway supposed to be doing. Okay, maybe for example, I want to get a license and then I pay a bribe to the government official to issue me a license. Basically, that's what he was appointed for. He was supposed to give me a license, but then I pay him for doing just that, and this is called bribery. Right? Okay, so this is a graph which shows different countries. On the left side, you will see these countries who are having high bribe quotient. That means it's possible that operating in this country you may have to pay bribe, while you could see that the countries on the right are those countries where bribes are not very rampant, and Singapore stands, I think Singapore, yeah, Sweden and Singapore stands at the lowest tendency towards bribery. So if you are operating in Singapore or Sweden, chances are that you may not be able to do your work by paying a bribe. You need to follow the rules and regulations of the country. Right, so let's go on. Here we'll talk about the actions that international bodies have taken in order to ensure that bribe does not take place. In fact, if a country is known to be having rampant bribes, then its own position in the international scenario is lost. So, anyways, there have been lot of agreements between countries and between uh, regional organizations which tried to bring down this concept of bribery and corruption. So some of them are here. OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. OECD is an organization of developed countries, especially the European countries. So they have brought in an agreement that which is rejecting the idea of bribe. So if any company is found to have paid bribe, a strict action would be taken against them. There is something like ICC Code of Rules, which is also an international agreement where corruption and bribe is to be avoided. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption is also in progress, and at the regional level, European Union has its own effort trying to bring about a stop to bribe and corruption. The U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation for the U.S. Is also a regional initiative where the U.S. government is putting force to ensure that there are no corrupt practices in the US happening either in the business world and through Sarbanes-Oxley in the financial world. Then at the industry level also there has been some initiative. In 2005, World Economic Forum had signed an agreement called as the Zero Tolerance for Corruption and Bribery Pact, which I believe is still in action. It's still active, right? So next we'll talk about how ethics and environment are related. So here we'll talk about, whenever the companies are maybe behaving unethically. On one side, we just saw that it's possible that they may do corruption, that is, they may pay bribe and get their things done. So it can also be seen as related. When the company is giving bribe, it's possible that they are bribing the government officials, maybe to give them a clean chit, maybe when they are compromising the environment, or maybe when they are doing something which is unethical in nature. So in that case, we need to bring in the environment into picture. So companies compromise environment, like for example, they may contaminate air, soil, water during the manufacturing or producing products which can emit fossil fuel contaminants and pollute the environment. And can you see that this environmental pollution itself, or harming the environment itself, is an unethical behavior? But if it is combined with corruption, that is, if you are giving bribe to the government officials and asking them to give you a clear chit, this actually compounds to double the ethical, we can say, misbehavior of the particular company. And they are related. If a company can be unethical, it could also be corrupt, right? So fine. The next point here is it also affects the natural resource extraction, that is renewable or non-renewable resources which is available on the earth. The companies needs to be ethical in using and extracting these resources. The topic here is about sustainability. What is sustainability? Sustainability is that as human beings, or maybe as corporate citizens, every person is responsible to make sure that you are making use of the natural resources in such a way that you are not compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs when the time comes. So, is sustainability a good business practice? Yes, it is. So, that is why you will see that in today's world, companies are advertising that they are following sustainability. You may have heard of green business. The word green is always highlighted in most of the companies around the world. Fine. So there is an agreement called the Kyoto Protocol. I'll explain it a little bit, but then I think I'll give you a small video which you can watch on Kyoto Protocol. It was started. I mean, this is a protocol. This was an agreement which was signed by, I think today more than 183 countries have signed this Kyoto Protocol, where they have found that it is big companies who are emitting carbon dioxide gas into the world, which is leading to the green gas house effect. And that's why they wanted to bring down this emission, and they wanted to take a promise from many countries of the world, saying that they will try to bring in rules and regulations where their companies are, trying to cut the greenhouse gas emission, and the level was 5.2% below the 1990 levels. They keep 1990 as the base, and below, I mean, whatever was the level in 1992, they want to reduce that level by 5.2%. And the time gap was also given 2008 to 2012. But it should be noted that big countries, especially the US, had not ratified this agreement. They had not signed this agreement. Even then, the other countries together have really found that this Kyoto Protocol had become much, much successful. Right, so I'll go on to talk about some other topics here. We'll talk about ethical dilemmas in pharmaceutical industry. Now, when we talk about pharmaceutical industry, basically it is the industry which produces medicines. So there are two concerns here. On one side, from the point of view of the company, they spend huge amount of money in the research and development of drugs, which they want to sell at a higher price and then recover the money that they have spent on R&D. However, on the other side, these medicines that they have found could be life-saving drugs for many people who may not be having the ability to pay. So, to strike a balance between the two, there is a ethical dilemma. Should the pharmaceutical companies be allowed to collect high price for the new drugs which they have found, maybe after a lot of research, you can see this happening even in the current scenario. On the other side, should they not consider themselves responsible for providing these drugs, maybe to people and to the countries who are not in a position to pay for them? So in fact, there have been different types of agreements which has been happening. The WTO agreement, we saw what is WTO, that is the World Trade Organization. It has done an agreement called as trade related aspect of intellectual property, right? For short, it is called TRIPS. It is basically about the generic drugs, where the companies or the countries agree to supply generic drugs, maybe drugs which are very very generic, in the sense that uh, for common ailments, like maybe a Brufen or maybe a paracetamol, they should allow poor countries to start producing these drugs without having to pay the huge patent right payments. Okay, so similarly, R&D, I mean, they should also share the know-how with countries which can produce these drugs at a cheaper price. Like for example, India is found to be have the ability to produce generic drugs at a cheaper price, and also to sell it to the poor countries of the world at a cheaper price. However, if they were forced to pay for the patent rights, this would not have been possible. So, can you see this is a dilemma on both the sides? Should the pharmaceutical industry protect its intellectual property, or should it adhere to the requirements of people and their ailments? Right. We'll talk about this point here. We'll talk about labor conditions. We know that international companies, they usually are in search of places where they can produce or manufacture their products at a cheaper price, where especially those countries where labor is available freely. However, there is a big ethical discussion, or we can say a big ethical consideration, considering the way in which these countries are trying to extract the cheap labor by maybe paying lower wages, or maybe by employing child labor, bad working conditions, or maybe higher working hours, and even sometimes they don't allow them to form unions. So these are the five concerns against the labor which are considered to be unethical. So as big companies, usually they need to be concerned about the wages, the child labor, the working conditions, the working hours, and also the freedom of association which they provide to companies. There are a lot of examples of big companies actually going out of their way to provide better labor conditions to the people. Now I'm coming to the next slide. Here we talk about what makes these huge companies actually follow the ethical uh, what you say ethical consideration. So here we say that there are some pressure groups that are working. So you can see in this diagram that maybe the pressure could come from the consumers, from the corporate investors who are concerned about the ethical aspects of the company, the NGOs, that is the non-government organization, which are working as a pressure group to ensure that big companies do not exploit maybe poor countries and so on. The government can play a big role in ensuring that the companies behave ethically. The trade unions are association of workers who get together to ensure that the companies do not behave unethically. The media itself can play a big role in putting pressure on the companies to behave ethically. And finally, even the individual investors, when they make sure that they are going to only invest in those companies which follow ethics. So here, as a continuation of that topic where we're talking about the labor condition, International Labor Organization, it is a group of the uh, UN. So here they have found that more than 250 million children aged from 5 to 17 are still working. So as a result of that, especially in the poor parts of the world, so you see that as a result of that, some companies totally avoid operating in such countries where child labor is common. While there are some companies like IKEA, really we need to appreciate IKEA, that it operates in such countries where there are rampant child labor. But what they do is they really behave very responsibly. What they have done is they have um, actually tried to increase the wages that they pay to the workers, and also ensure that there is a bridge school within close proximity of where people are working, so that they can send their children to school rather than bring them to work. So some companies, they refuse to hire individuals who want to work for long hours. I mean, they just don't allow people to take overtime work because it's possible that such the pressure group might frame them for exploitation of labor. Right. Then finally, we'll talk about corporate code of ethics. So we need to understand that in a globalized world, it's very important that the companies not only follow ethics but also to show that they are following ethics. So how should a company behave? Normally, the UN Global Compact establishes guidelines and behavior for human rights. So basically, the broad areas in which companies would be judged is: one is how they treat the labor, second is what harm they bring into the environment, and third is corruption. I believe these are the three topics which we have already discussed in the previous slides. So what are the motivation for the companies to behave in a responsible manner? So first, I mean, if you remember in the beginning slide, we have already discussed those, that it ensures, that the company remains in business and so on. So basically here we could say that if any company is found to be behaving unethically or irresponsibly, it's possible that they could get some legal sanction, because most of the ethical behaviors are now brought under the legal purview. And also the consumers might sometimes boycott their products. Even the employee morale may be very low. I mean, they may not get highly satisfied employees. That means their production could be affected, and also their cost of sales could be high because of bad publicity. So a company usually sets a I mean, has to set a code of conduct within their broad framework. So usually it will set a global policy that must be complied with by every member of the company. It has to communicate the code of conduct not only in the books, but also they have to communicate it with the employees, the suppliers, and the subcontractors. It should also ensure that the policies are carried out systematically, and finally they have to report the results to external stakeholders. In this case, you need to see that most big companies, maybe whether it is an Aramco or a Sabic or any big companies that you could see, they definitely have a policy for their ethical behavior, or sometimes they may even call it as the corporate responsibility that they follow. Basic what the here, as in most chapters, this is what the author says. He says that there could be two things that is happening. There will be more and more emphasis on ethical conduct of companies, and also it will require individuals to develop skills to address ethical issues. Now on this, I think I'm going to share with you one video which is about, it is a TED talk uh, which explains how as individuals we should make ourselves responsible to behave ethically and get the courage to behave ethically in a modern world. Okay, and then the second thing is the impact of social media. As we have already seen, social media plays a big role in ensuring that the companies follow ethical principles. Sometimes there can be rumors, but most of the times the messages that is spread out about the company are true. Impact of future business and government leaders is also true, and we are already seeing this happening. Okay, so with that we'll end the chapter. I hope you are able to understand the concepts. Please make sure you're reading the textbook. Inshallah, see you again in the next chapter.